What if I told you that the cause of our current political climate today can be traced back to one consequential event in history? From the global rise of the far right, to masked ICE agents kidnapping people off the streets, to the emergence of private big tech mass surveillance, and even to Congress's unwillingness to change American foreign policy no matter how unpopular it has become. All of this, and much, much more, can be directly attributed to one consequential event from 2001. The Mummy Returns, starring Brendan Fraser. Oh wait, I mean 9/11. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Ben, you're just cherry-picking an event in history and then tying our modern-day political policies and overall trajectory as a society back to an event that everybody knows about. And to that I say, yeah, I am. But for good reason. Because I can almost guarantee you, even though you might think you know how all of these things connect to 2001, like I thought I did, I was still surprised to learn a lot that I didn't know. So I hope this video can help provide some much-needed context, because if you're like me, you've probably spent the past few years wondering, how the f did we get here? Hey, it's been a minute, and today I'm going to explain to you why I blame everything on 9/11.
I don't want to blame it all on 9/11, but it certainly didn't help.
Our current political state didn't appear out of nowhere. The roots of our foreign policy, this creeping authoritarianism, and this early form of American fascism were actually planted years before. I know it would be a lot easier to simply blame all of this on people who voted for Trump, or hell, even Trump himself, but that's just not really the case. As you'll see, 9/11, and more specifically the response to it, really makes our current political situation almost seem inevitable. Trump or no Trump, the decisions made post 9/11 paved the way for where we are today. So without further ado, let's start where all great video essays about the early 2000s do, with the Cold War. To understand why I blame everything on 2001, you have to understand the circumstances that led to those planes crashing into those towers. The Cold War really only makes sense to me when I dispense with the notion that this was a battle of conflicting ideologies. Communism versus capitalism, authoritarianism versus democracy, and to see it for what it was actually really about. It was stripped of sentiment or morality or ideals. Instead, it was about gaining, maintaining, and asserting geopolitical control. Reagan actually summed up the US approach pretty well. Here's my strategy on the Cold War. We win, they lose. Hell yeah, brother Reagan. And over the course of decades, the United States government proved it was willing to do almost anything to make this strategy a winning one. Whether that meant supporting authoritarian despots like Pinochet in Chile, or the Shah in Iran, or some guy named Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Yes, this is Bush's Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld shaking Saddam's hand. Or carpet bombing civilians in proxy wars. Or doing so many CIA coups. Seriously, guys, if I had a nickel for every time the US involved itself in a foreign regime change, I'd have literally over 350 nickels. For 40 years, the US flexed its military and economic might to ensure they would win the battle to become the next global hegemon. And in the process, they empowered a relationship that would become a defining feature of US foreign policy. The military-industrial complex. Coined by Eisenhower in his farewell address, the military-industrial complex describes the symbiotic relationship between the US military, the defense contractors who arm it, and the policymakers who fund it. Here's Eisenhower, rather presciently, warning of the potential for the military-industrial complex's destructive impacts.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The military-industrial complex became so powerful that by the time of the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, the United States was spending nearly $300 million on defense annually. This was around 10 to 20 times the budget of our European allies. Only now, there was a really big problem. We didn't have anybody to fight.
We are spending $270 billion a year on the military, but we don't have a major enemy.
So yeah, the US needed to find a new war for our big, beautiful military to involve itself in. Any guesses on which one it was? I'll give you a hint. It primarily took place in a Gulf, and it was a war. But before we break down this mystery war, I actually wanted to tell you about some people who are fighting a much cooler war. A war that I can actually get behind. A war against big banks and creditors. We all know the system isn't broken. It's rigged against us. And if you happen to be buried in debt, that's exactly how they want it. Big banks profit when you are desperate. Creditors win when you lose. But you don't have to play their game. PDS Debt helps you take back control. They've helped hundreds of thousands break free from credit cards, loans, collections, or medical bills. PDS Debt goes beyond the numbers to understand your unique financial situation and craft a personalized plan designed just for you. There's no minimum credit score required. They're here to help you save more money, pay off your debt faster, and start putting money back where it belongs. Into your pocket. PDS Debt is A+ rated by the Better Business Bureau, boasts thousands of 5-star reviews on Google, and holds a 5-star rating on Trustpilot. They're rated so highly because PDS Debt has helped hundreds of thousands of people get out of debt. We've all either dealt with it or know someone who's dealing with it. The stress of trying to manage a crushing loan. I've been there before, and as an American who has to use American hospitals, I know I'm just one medical emergency away from being there again. Landed the free, baby. But if I ever found myself in that situation again, I would turn to PDS Debt for help. You're 30 seconds away from being debt-free. Get your free assessment and find the best option for you right now at pdsdebt.com/Benaminute. That's pdsdebt.com/Benaminute. pdsdebt.com/Benaminute. And thank you to PDS Debt for sponsoring this video. All right, back to it.
In the early stages of military operations.
So you have to remember, in 2001, the world was just a decade removed from the dissolution of the Soviet Union into component republics, marking the end of the nearly 50 years of tense geopolitical turmoil. The idealists among us might have once hoped that this would lead to a period of peace and prosperity, denuclearization and demilitarization, the whole international community uniting under a sense of shared humanity. But of course, that didn't happen. Because around the exact same time the Cold War was ending, a broke-ass Saddam Hussein, desperate for oil, accused Kuwait, that's so hard to say, accused Kuwait of slant drilling. He just made this up, by the way, they weren't. And promptly launched a full-scale invasion. Now look, a lot of the horrible things the US government and Interpol and your drunk Uncle Larry, who is maybe a little bit racist against Middle Easterners, said about Saddam Hussein were true. He was a brutal, repressive dictator who built a cult of personality around fear and propaganda. He seized power by personally overseeing the torture and killing of his political enemies. He deployed chemical weapons first as a war crime against Iranians and then against minorities like the Kurds in his own country. Although, to be fair, those weapons were sold to him by Western allies, and we didn't really seem to mind it at first back in the 80s. And also, quick side note, his son Uday Hussein genuinely might have been one of the worst human beings to ever live. For example, some of his hobbies included locking his friends in cages with his drunken and violent pet monkey, torturing Iraq's athletes for poor performance as he oversaw the Iraqi Olympic Committee, and sadistically murdering and raping hundreds of individuals throughout his father's decades-long reign in power. Even Uday's own daddy said, "Yeah, my son kinda scares me." Saddam was especially pissed at his son when Uday, quote, bludgeoned and stabbed one of Saddam's favorite attendants to death at a party. Saddam was so mad about this that he even grounded Uday by taking away his Xbox Live and didn't let him stay over at any friend's house for a whole month. Just kidding, he had him imprisoned and then beaten. Anyway, I could make a whole separate video on how evil Uday Hussein was, but for now, let's get back to what his daddy did that was very not cool and led the US into your Uncle Larry's favorite war. Because according to him, this one was pretty freaking badass. Okay, so the United States was not okay with the invasion of Kuwait.
Iraq's tanks stormed in blitzkrieg fashion through Kuwait in a few short hours.
Blitzkrieg fashion? You're making this guy kind of sound a little Hitlery. He must be pretty evil, but isn't this the same exact guy you supported while acting as vice president throughout the entire past decade? Well, not anymore. Now America and its allies were intent on bombing Iraq back into the Stone Age. And I actually mean that literally. By the end of Desert Storm, Iraq was operating at literally 4% of its pre-war electricity levels. Perhaps even more devastating were the economic sanctions exacted upon Iraq after Desert Storm. The blockades resulted in widespread famine within the country. The number of children who died from hunger and lack of clean water and power is heavily disputed, although we know it is an incredibly high number. What is indisputable is the icy indifference the US government officials showed towards their deaths. Here's Clinton's Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright. "We have heard that 500,000 Iraqi children have died. I mean, that is more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?" I think that is a very hard choice, but the price, we think, the price is worth it. Honestly, that answer kind of reminds me a lot of this recent one from newly bearded Pete Buttigieg.
To recognize a Palestinian state?
I think that's a
profound question that arouses a lot of the biggest problems that have happened with Israel's survival, or Israel's right to survival.
Okay, so what changed? Why was the U.S. all buddy-buddy with Rumsfeld and Saddam shaking hands in the 80s only to completely pivot and treat him as Hitler's second coming in the 90s? The answer is that it no longer served our interests. See, we had been totally okay with Saddam when he was serving as a counterweight to Iran, who we saw as an overriding threat ever since the Shah was deposed during the Islamic Revolution in 1979. But now that he was invading Kuwait, a major U.S. ally, well, all that changed. Also, for context, Kuwait sold us a lot of oil, and we're friends with Saudi Arabia, who also sold us a lot of oil. So this invasion was seen as another opportunity for the U.S. military-industrial complex to flex its muscles and show that it still mattered in a post-Cold War world. And I promise you, it's important to keep all of this in mind because it gives a lot of context to what's going to happen next. In 2001, right after...
In the middle of the building.
This one into the east tower.
Yes, right in the middle of the building.
So my actual coverage of the date, September 11th, 2001, is going to be pretty brief. We all know what happened, and there's plenty of videos and documentaries covering that day. But what's important to know is that 9/11 was a horrific tragedy that resulted in the deaths of nearly 3,000 people. I know this might be a hot take, but 9/11 was bad. I just kind of wish that I was a little bit older than 5 years old when it happened so I could have a cooler backstory, but I remember it. I was 5 and I had to stay home from school. It was really traumatic for me. Anyway, for this video, I see 9/11 as sort of a flashpoint in a much broader story. And what I mean by this is that I'm really interested in the context of 9/11. What happened before, which we've already talked about a bit, but most of all, what came after? The far-reaching implications that stretch into the bizarre world we live in today. What I really want people to understand is just how damn important 9/11 was. From the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, to the rise of the surveillance state, to the way fear reshaped public policy and civil liberties, the response to the towers falling defined 21st century America. So, yeah, never forget.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
It's hard to overstate the war fervor that enveloped the United States after 9/11. The war on terror had 83% approval. Do you know how hard it is to get 83% of Americans to agree on anything? W had a 90% approval rating. That's actually higher than George Washington at 89%.
Now watch this drive.
So perhaps it was inevitable that the United States would invade Afghanistan after that fateful September day. After all, the attacks had been orchestrated by the ominous, overarching, all-powerful global terrorist network Al-Qaeda, whose leader, Osama bin Laden, was based in Afghanistan. Only it's important to remember that even this narrative wasn't really true, because Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda kind of was never an actual thing. At least certainly not in the way that it was conceptualized by most people at the time. Here's what scholar and journalist Jason Burke had to say in his book Al-Qaeda, The True Story of Radical Islam. There is no international network with a leader, with Carters who will unquestioningly obey orders, with tentacles that stretch out to sleeper cells in America, in Africa, and Europe. The idea of a coherent, structured terrorist network with an organized capability simply does not exist. So yeah, the guy who literally wrote the book on Al-Qaeda says it never really existed. Great. But hey, you know what? At least bin Laden was actually in Afghanistan. I mean, that's something.
That an estimated 30 Iraqis surrendered at the border.
Wait, then what the hell are we doing in Iraq? Surely it was because Saddam was also involved in crashing the planes and hiring the hijackers? Or maybe he had ties to Al-Qaeda too? At the very least, he definitely had weapons of mass destruction, right? There's no way it could have been that the presidential administration at the time consisted of a cabal of bloodthirsty warhawk career military industrialists. Well, let's run through the roster to find out, shall we? Introducing from the W administration, at Vice President claiming that Iraq has WMD with no credible intelligence and dismissing the idea of weapons inspections entirely, Dick Cheney. At Secretary of Defense, a military-obsessed warmonger who is justifying the lack of WMD's credible evidence with googly-gook quotes.
As we know, there are known knowns. There are things we know. And we also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there's some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know.
Donald Rumsfeld. And Deputy Secretary of Defense, everyone's favorite neocon and ideological architect of the Iraq War, who blatantly and freely admitted that the fundamental U.S. interest in the security of the Persian Gulf is oil. Paul Fowlitz! So yeah, the Bush administration insisted that Saddam Hussein had stockpiles of chemical, biological, and possibly nuclear weapons. And it just wasn't true. The Iraq Survey Group, a US-led team of inspectors, spent over a year searching and concluded in 2004 that Saddam had no active W&D programs and no stockpiles at the time of the invasion. Some old, degraded chemical munitions from the 1980s were found, but they were not usable and not part of any active program. I think it's important to remember that the National Institute of Health estimates that we killed 600,000 people, conservatively, in Iraq. Obviously, it's not a competition, but that's around 200 times the amount of people who died in 9/11. In a country that really didn't have any actual connection to the attacks. But the effects of 9/11 weren't just limited to foreign and military policy abroad. Just look at what 9/11 led to right here in the good old US of A.
It's now my privilege to sign the Homeland Security Act. The Department of Homeland Security will have nearly 170,000 employees. The threat of mass murder on our own soil will be met with a unified, effective response.
Following the attacks on 9/11, the Bush administration passed a sweeping piece of legislation called the Homeland Security Act of 2002, and its major goal was the establishment of the Department of Homeland Security. The primary mission of the DHS was to prevent terrorist attacks within the United States. The director of DHS has been a cabinet-level position in every presidential administration since its creation, making it the 15th in total and the first to be added since 1989. Members of the president's cabinet must be confirmed by the Senate and are part of the presidential line of succession, making the director of the DHS 18th in line for the presidency, and in turn making this a position of interest for sycophants and tryhards alike. Another goal of the Department of Homeland Security was to reshape and combine dozens of previously existing agencies under one roof, like Customs and Border Patrol, which is charged with the law enforcement, specifically along points of entry. The United States Coast Guard, tasked with our maritime safety and borders. Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, responsible for the response and recovery following widespread national emergencies. Transportation Security Administration, or TSA, whose main job is making sure that everybody gets their shoes off, belts off, laptops out of your bags now, during what is inevitably everyone in front of you's first day flying since 1990. And of course, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, who lately have been prying sobbing children from the arms of their soon-to-be deported parents at the direction of former freelance dog executioner and current head of DHS, Kristi Noem. So whether you are a Mexican woman entering Texas on a temporary work visa, a New Orleans receiving direction to an aid station after a hurricane, a ship captain from England entering port in Baltimore, or a Tampa Bay-bound divorced dad at the Oklahoma City airport being commanded to take your shoes off, you all have one thing in common with each other. You are face-to-face with an employee of the sprawling Department of Homeland Security. Today, Americans and the world most commonly link the agency ICE to the Department of Homeland Security. So how did DHS, created with the mission to stop terrorist attacks, become involved in the comprehensive deportation effort that Trump and Stephen Miller have made a central piece of their second term? The Trump administration has been able to effectively weaponize ICE for a few reasons. Unlike the FBI, that operates as an apolitical organization and has done its best to rebuff Trump's pointed strong-arm tactics, ICE has been easily re-engineered from a law enforcement agency into a political agency. Recently, many of the employment requirements have been changed or scrapped in order to facilitate higher recruitment into ICE. A bachelor's degree used to be required to join ICE, but now it seems like the only thing needed is alignment with the Republicans' immigration stance. With the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, Congress has made ICE the highest funded law enforcement agency in the federal government by providing ICE with an extra $75 billion for immigration enforcement. When you consider that ICE is now better funded than Ukraine's, France's, and Japan's national militaries, with an amount that would place it in the top 10 funded militaries in the world, you realize that Trump has not only weaponized, but funded a domestic police force with great success. Great success, very nice. I get one Borat quote per video, okay? That's the price you got to pay for watching my content. Thank you. Please subscribe. Trump's goons have also successfully changed the definition of what we consider a criminal. Being in the country as an undocumented person is a civil offense, not a criminal offense. This is very important to know. But Trump has labeled every single undocumented non-citizen as a criminal. ICE, I guess, kind of used to work under a veneer of credibility and would typically only target undocumented immigrants with violent criminal records, which prompted Stephen Miller, the architect behind Trump's deportation policy, to ask ICE officials, "What do you mean you're going after criminals? Why aren't you at Home Depot? Why aren't you at the 7-Eleven?" DHS was supposed to protect us from terrorist operations within our borders, but today its mission is to inflict terror on Central and South American immigrants, no matter how devastating the effects may be on our economy, our conscience, and our friends and neighbors. If you are an American citizen watching this, you should be extremely fearful of DHS's reach and funding, and the ease with which it designates who it sees fit as criminals. ICE has become the secret police of the United States, hidden by masks, lurking in vans, patrolling Home Depots and 7-Elevens at the request of a white nationalist. But hey, that's what the Patriots voted for. Speaking of Patriots, the other piece of legislation that set the stage for the attacks on our civil liberties following 9/11 was the bill known as the USA Patriot Act.
Patriot Act, Patriot Act. I love it, I love it, I love it.
Which is actually an acronym that stands for Uniting and Strengthening America by providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorism. While it's nice to know that the Bush administration was at least having a little fun while planning to simultaneously invade the Middle East and turn the United States into a surveillance state, its everlasting impact on our society does leave me a bit miffed.
Now watch this drive.
Let's take a look at the I in Patriot Act. Intercept. Thanks to real American heroes like Mark Klein and Edward Snowden. Oh, right. I forgot they're listening. Thanks to traitors like Mark Klein and Edward Snowden, Americans now know that one of the large-scale offenses committed, thanks to the legislation, was illegal gathering of communications by American citizens on our phones, on our computers, and for God's sake, they probably hacked your Neopets account too. Mark Klein worked for AT&T in San Francisco in the 2000s when he discovered that the NSA, in collusion with AT&T, was intercepting, copying, and analyzing internet data from users including your emails, Google searches, and phone calls. The Bush administration would say that this was only monitoring suspects that made calls or other means of contact back to the Middle East.
Good morning. This is a highly classified program that is crucial to our national security.
Which is kind of just them admitting that they were fine with racial profiling without condoning mass surveillance of its own citizens. While the Bush administration was putting together the Patriot Act in the hours following the attacks and getting it signed just 45 days later, an 18-year-old Edward Snowden was being driven to serve in the Army and 12 years later continued to serve his country through his work at the NSA. Snowden would eventually release an absolute treasure trove of information on the NSA spying operations and even showing action just 3 days following September 11th. From September 14th on, the NSA granted itself the power to surveil any American on U.S. soil who was in digital contact with a foreign country where terrorism was known to exist. No warrant needed. So while the NSA and US government would maintain it only tracked the communications of people they deemed suspicious, Snowden allowed us to see what the NSA was really able to collect. The NSA was collecting information from individuals to create what it called a pattern of life. And this is the way that you would be caught during the fishing expedition for data. They allowed themselves 3 hops, or 3 degrees of separation from their target. For example, let's say that they used the target's Facebook page to start creating his or her pattern of life. The first degree would include all of the target's friends on Facebook. Let's say they have 200. When the NSA moves to the next degree, friends of friends, they've now included over 30,000 people in that search. Now moving to that third degree of separation from their intended target, friends of friends of friends, they have involved over 5 million people in their illegal search. So when we look at the amount of data the NSA was able to collect, we have to remember that they were just one agency. The FBI and CIA and hosts of other alphabet soup government agencies all benefited from the Patriot Act and helped create a vast web of data and metadata on US citizens that we all know still exists today. And we were outraged by it. It was an affront to our privacy, our constitution, our sense of self. And somehow today we are still under attack from the same means of data collection, but this time from private companies with acronyms you find on the stock ticker, not in government budget reports. It's not just DOD, it's META. It's not just NSA, it's AMZN. It's not FBI, it's PLTR. And there is a huge difference between the government spying on us and voluntarily opting into social media terms and conditions. The government can use the information it gathers to arrest you, detain you, to deport you, to label you a terrorist. But for now, Google can't. But provisions of the Patriot Act have been rolled back. There's been public outcry and Congresspeople who have made it their goal to deconstruct this surveillance apparatus. But Mark Klein and Edward Snowden exposed us to the reality that private companies like AT&T and Verizon are working in collaboration with the US government to collect this data. Today, we see this relationship between billionaire tech CEOs like Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, and Peter Thiel, and our sitting presidents.
Mark, would you like to say a few words about the company?
Well, thanks for hosting us. I mean, this is quite a group to get together.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's a great honor to work here at the White House and to work for you.
Very grateful for your administration support.
We look forward to working together, and thanks for your leadership.
We're so grateful for that support.
Thank you so much, obviously, for bringing us all together and the policies that you have put in place.
These tech companies grow increasingly more powerful. Peter Thiel literally owns J.D. Vance. He's widowy his widow slave, and there seems to be little Congress can do to hold them accountable, even when they offer us a public accounting of what these companies are up to behind the scenes.
Was your data included in the data sold to the malicious third parties?
Yes.
It was.
Our data was valuable to the United States government. And at least this is what they told us in order to spot the next terrorist before they had time to concoct, coordinate, and collide into more towers. Now those very same indicators are used in social media algorithms to reinforce users' interests. Now that data may help fuel the next extremist, not flag them.
Standing in Iran's way is one proud pro-American democracy, my country, the State of Israel.
And finally, look, as bad as Iraq and Afghanistan were, they were really just the beginning. Because what happens when you destabilize a country, dismantle its military, and leave a power vacuum? That's right, ISIS. Born from the ashes of post-invasion Iraq, fueled by sectarian chaos and religious zeal, and armed to the teeth by leftover US weapons, oopsie, ISIS became everything that we claimed Al-Qaeda was in the first place. Al-Qaeda was sending out VHS tapes and sitting around in caves plotting vague assassination attempts against Western diplomats. ISIS, on the other hand, was f***ing organized. They had a well-disciplined and structured central command that enacted taxes and courts that administered Islamic law. Even worse, whereas Al-Qaeda was more secretive and strategic, sometimes forsaking violence to avoid detection, ISIS made violence their calling card. They built a powerful and violent military that wreaked havoc on their enemies within the region. Apostates, Kurds, LGBTQ people, basically anyone not Sunni extremist. The result was an Islamic State that at its peak controlled about a third of Syria and nearly half of Iraq. And while we waged a forever war on terror in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria and Yemen and Libya and Somalia and Pakistan, Israel saw our war on terror pitch and thought,
I could do that.
The Israeli government and the IDF began to adopt the war on terror branding to reframe Palestinian resistance to settler colonialists as terrorism. Cue the expansion of settlements, the apartheid wall, and a PR campaign that does its best to disguise genocide as national security. And the whole time, neither major American political party has had a problem with any of this. The House of Representatives annually gave the IDF billions of dollars by votes that were like 420-9. And the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned us about nearly 65 years ago just keeps on chugging. So yeah, if you're wondering why everything feels so broken, why we're still bombing countries most Americans couldn't even find on a map, why civil liberties have eroded while defense contractors and now big tech have boomed, why bipartisan consensus only seems to exist when it comes to war, well, blame 2001. And with all of the power the federal government was able to gain over its citizens in the response to those two towers falling, it almost makes you ask the question, did Bush do 9/11?